Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you so much all for coming. My name is Gaston Alonso. I am the director of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute for the Humanities at Brooklyn College. On behalf of Samuel J. Konefsky's family, on behalf of the donors of the Samuel J. Konefsky Memorial Fund, on behalf of the Office of the Dean of Humanities and Social Science, Dean Phil Napoli, on behalf of the Department of Political Science, including its Chair Emmanuel Ness, and the dozen other departments, programs, and centers who are sponsoring today's event, it is my honor and my joy to welcome you to the 2024 Samuel J. Konefsky Memorial Lecture. The lecture will be delivered by Fordham Law School Professor Tanya Katerí Hernández. Welcome to Brooklyn College. And it is now my honor to introduce the president of Brooklyn College, Michelle J. Anderson.
Wow, this is a packed house. How wonderful to see you all here for such an important lecture today. I want to start actually by thanking Gaston for truly outstanding leadership of the Ethel R. Wolf Institute. I want to thank the excellent staff of the Wolf Institute, Humanities and Social Sciences Dean Philip Napoli, and the entire Political Science Department, and all the other departments and programs that co-sponsored this event for helping make it possible. On behalf of Brooklyn College now, because every other entity has welcomed you, I'd like to welcome you to this event. This significant event highlights the extraordinary work done by our School of Humanities and Social Sciences and by the Ethel R. Wolf Institute under the leadership of Gaston and his team. None of this would be possible without the generous support of Margaret Konefsky Blank, Professor Arthur Blank, Professors Alfred Konefsky and Diane Avery, and supporters of the Konefsky Memorial Fund. I really want to thank everybody for their support of this program. The Samuel Konefsky Memorial Lecture is important because it allows us to really celebrate one of the best faculty members Brooklyn College has ever had, Samuel Konefsky himself. He was an alum to Brooklyn College, graduated in 1937 cum laude. He taught political science and constitutional law here for 33 years. And he took extraordinary pride in being able to teach Brooklyn College students. His tradition of mentorship is fondly remembered and also carried out today. It is my pleasure to be a part of this event and the Konefsky legacy. I want to begin by congratulating our student award winner, Milada Sirota, a political science major with a minor in professional and applied ethics in the Macaulay Honors Program. Milada is passionate about advocacy, and she has a goal to go on and become a social justice attorney. And we all hope that this award helps you achieve your goal, Milada. Today, we are extremely honored to welcome Tanya Hernandez to our college once again and to deliver this lecture. She is, of course, the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University. You're going to hear her full bio later, but I want to highlight the work she does in critical race theory, inequality, and anti-discrimination. And personally, thank you for that work. It's inspiring to so many of us who are committed to that kind of work and to the legacy you're bringing, the new insight you're bringing to it. I want to thank you in particular for allowing us to have these copies of this extraordinary book for many of the attendees today. The book is Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. Thank you very much for having it available for our attendees. I'm excited to read it. I know you all are too. I'm going to turn it over now to Professor Anna Law, who is the Herbert Kurz Chair in Constitutional Rights. And again, thank you all for coming. Anna.
Thank you, everyone. I am one of the faculty members that teaches all the classes in the political science department on constitutional law, federal courts, civil rights, and civil liberties. So today I have the pleasure of saying a few more things about the Konefsky family. And the reason why we're here is because the Konefsky family has designated this event and also scholarship for Brooklyn College. So Samuel J. Konefsky, as President Anderson said, was a alum of Brooklyn College, and he and his wife Roma, both immigrants from Ukraine and Poland respectively, they met while they were students at Brooklyn College. People, you don't need a dating app, okay? While pursuing your college education, you can meet the love of your life. So Professor Konefsky, he went on to Columbia to get a PhD, and when he worked at Brooklyn College, he was paid $7.50 a week. And he had a distinguished teaching career. While he worked for Brooklyn College, he would often take research, visiting positions at other less well-known institutions like Yale, Johns Hopkins, Harvard, or Princeton, but he always came back to Brooklyn College, and he has many distinguished students of his own that work in law and politics. So we already have the Samuel J. Konefsky Memorial Scholarship winner this year, and I wanted her to come up and shake my hand. And it is Milada Sirota, who President Anderson already said she's a political science major, professional and applied ethics minor in the Macaulay Honors College. She served on the undergraduate student government as a student senator and in the executive cabinet in the position of student advocate and chair of the Student Affairs Committee. She's very passionate and a strong advocate fighting anti-racism on campus and off. Milada is graduating from college this December, 2.5 years early. So if she could come up here and everyone could give her a round of applause for this year's Samuel J. Konefsky Memorial Scholarship winner. So let me turn now to our distinguished speaker. We are weeks away from a very consequential U.S. election like no other. The standard bearer of the Republican Party has been running not on a racially charged, not on a racially tinged, not on a racially freighted campaign. He's been running on an openly racist and anti-immigrant platform. That white supremacy continues to be viable and have such a strong hold in American politics and U.S. life, that's bad enough. But that white supremacy and racism is replicated by other non-white groups toward Black people. We have a bigger problem. And today our speaker is an expert on this topic. Professor Hernandez, Tanya Katerí Hernández, is the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law. She's the Associate Director of its Center on Race, Law, and Justice. She received her bachelor's degree from Brown University and her JD from Yale Law School. She's an internationally recognized comparative race and law scholar and a Fulbright scholar. So today she's sharing some insight from her book, Racial Innocence, Unmasking Latino and Anti-Black Bias and the Struggle for Equality. This is the first comprehensive book that tackles and unpacks the misconceptions that if you have a community like Latinos who have themselves been discriminated against, that they won't discriminate against other non-white groups. So I welcome Professor Hernandez to the college and look forward to her talk.
Thank you very, very much for that warm welcome. It's lovely to be back on campus. I was here, this was just last March, when we were uplifted my sister's book, Professor Jasmine Mitchell's, Dr. Mitchell's book on Imagining the Mulata. If you missed it, you should talk to her about it. Fabulous book. It's also lovely to be back on campus because when I was a young lawyer, first starting my career, I was a Brooklyn resident and Brooklyn lawyer. I worked for the Brooklyn Legal Services, Corporation B, over on Court Street. It's still there. And part of my job was as the staff attorney assigned to doing emergency wills. At that time, I worked in what was called the HIV unit, when HIV and AIDS were lethal, and drugs like we do now. In any case, that job took me all over Brooklyn because I would go to people's homes, to people in the hospital, care centers, to help them plan their estates and take care of their loved ones, and most particularly make plans for their young children in their estate planning. So in any case, I got to see all parts of Brooklyn. Didn't get to come to this campus though. None of my clients were. But in any case, I have love for Brooklyn, and it's always good to be back. Let me cue up my PowerPoint so you not get tired looking at my face the whole entire time. Here. What's this? The other thing I want to sort of just quickly mention, you may be wondering, like, just cancel it. I don't know what's going on with that. I'll just say safe. Just be safe. Maybe I won't. Okay. Is that you may find it peculiar that I am talking about being a wills attorney, and yet the talk I'm about to talk to you today nothing to do with inheritance. Unless, of course, we think about racial attitudes as a form of inheritance. I think that works. But in any case, and the reason why I want to just stop there for a moment is because I know many of you may be pre-law students, thinking about being pre-law students, or wondering whether you can be pre-law students. And I just want to sort of show you as an example, a career can be long and varied. Where you begin is not necessarily where you stay. You contain multitudes, and so can your career. Right? So it's another way to say, after the presentation, during the question and answer, you just want to talk, what's it like in law school? I am happy to have that conversation with you as well. You don't just have to talk about the book, right? The book speaks for itself. Okay. Oh. I set it up. What's the matter? Oh, I did it. I have young people in my life, so they keep me up to date on some of the technology. Okay. So, an important challenge for racial justice. Oh, and I want to thank the Konefsky family. Thank you so much for your support and for letting me be here with you all today. So, an important challenge for racial justice that often gets overlooked is the anti-Black bias that exists in communities themselves considered ethnic and racial minorities. Indeed, the conundrum of how anti-Black violence can still be so pervasive decades after the achievements of the civil rights movement cannot be readily understood nor addressed with the traditional sole focus on white Anglo-English speaking individuals. In the language of the United States Census Bureau, non-Hispanic whites are presently only about 57.8% of the population, and they are declining in numbers. You can have a chat about what the census really measures, but that's a separate conversation. Right? This means that the ongoing upkeep and silent acceptance of anti-Blackness implicates many other racial groups. They alone can't keep it up standing all by themselves. Now, okay. So, exploring Latino complicity in anti-Blackness seems like a puzzle in traditional constitutional law, specifically with the 14th Amendment equality principle. Enacted after the violence of the Civil War, it was meant to be understood as a way to ensure that Southern states did not encroach upon the citizenship of the newly emancipated. So that's its backdrop, that's its history, but that's not where it stays. Right? It applies to many more people and many more contexts. However, When looking at Latino complicity and anti-Blackness, there seems to be a cognitive dissonance. Judges are very perturbed by this. Where we see it sort of most closely, and where I'm going to talk to you about it the most today, is within the ways in which the equality principle from the Constitution manifests itself in a whole host of civil rights statutory laws. As you can see from the language of the principle, right, it focuses on whether the state, whether government entities, right, are doing the discriminating. But for the average person on the street, where they often tend to feel the brunt of discrimination is not from the state government, though that does exist, but from their fellow employees, from potential landlords, from restaurant owners who won't let them in or treat them shabbily, right, because of what they look like. That's the host and the enforcement of the equality principle, but through statutory law, like equal employment rights, right? Through Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, through the Fair Housing Act, and a whole host of other civil rights statutory law. Oh, now, as a multi-hued ethnic group, Latinos are often viewed as free of racism, or at least its most exclusionary forms. However, recent events, or not so recent events, tend to suggest that that is not the case. Examining how anti-Blackness does still manage to man itself amongst the racially mixed rainbow of Latinos in the equality claims of Afro-Latinos, West Indians, Africans, the African diaspora, is a powerful illustration of how people of color themselves can fortify racism. The January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol included several Latino members of the white supremacist group, the Proud Boys, and their chairman, Cuban-American Enrique Tarrio, who was sentenced to 22 years in prison, the central role he played in organizing his followers to attack the Capitol, just as the white supremacist violence in Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 2017, also included Latino attackers. The Southern Poverty Law Center has noticed the increasing trend of more media reports of Latinos joining white supremacist hate groups. Pause it for a second. I'm from an older generation, so what automatically flows out of my mouth is the language Latino, but I am a full opportunity identifying term person. So if you want to talk to me about Latine, Latinx, Latina / O, I welcome it all. I have no particular political agenda by using the O. It's just kind of what I go with and saying it. Okay. So that's Virginia. It also shows up in the reports of lone gunmen who are aspiring to be members of white supremacist groups like Mauricio Garcia from Allen, Texas. The racial violence is also evident amongst white Latino law enforcement members. A few minutes to sort of take a look at the connections. We think of the murder of Sandra Bland as solely about African American identity, right? And what gets lost is the Latinx representation, unfortunately. Similarly, with the murder of Philando Castile. And then there's all the ones that don't make the main headlines, such as this Florida police officer. And yet, Latino white supremacists, or I should say, the racial violence is also evident in Latino opponents to Black Lives Matter. And yet, Latino white supremacists are not the only problem. Anti-Blackness is also showing up in Latino communities against Afro-Latinos, African Americans, and other people of African descent in a myriad of contexts, such as the workplace, the rental and purchase of homes, educational settings, public spaces of leisure, and the criminal justice system. Examining Latino agency in the anti-Blackness helps us better understand the complexities of racism and what equality law needs to sort of better understand in our increasingly racially diverse world. Now, just before I discuss the deepness here of the Latino anti-Black bias and how it surfaces in these anti-discrimination law cases, I just want to take a quick pulse of the room. How many of you are already aware of Latin America's presence of people of African descent, its history of the slave trade, and the racism that exists there? Okay. I can flow over those slides nicely then, just for the few folks in the room need a little bit more refresher. Okay. But I'm always happy to answer more questions about that. I want to leave time to kind of get into the details of the equality cases. Okay. So often when I try to explain sort of the origins of Latino anti-Black bias, there is a tendency, not amongst you all, but with, let's call them media, right? Interviewers. They're like, so how is it Latinos are duplicating, replicating, copying the white supremacy that they see and observe in the United States, right? As if Latinos come in a blank slate and all that evil is taught to them by others. You need to go back, look at Latin America and its influence in the Caribbean on Latino attitudes. Some historians suggest that between 65 to 90% of the transatlantic slave trade that brought approximately 10.7 million enslaved Africans were taken to Latin America and the Caribbean, whereas only 3.5% or so were brought to what we now call the United States. Today, there are approximately 150 million people and more, because of the census politics, right, of African descent in Latin America, representing about 1/3 of the total population. And these are considered very conservative demographic figures, given the histories of undercounting the number of people of African descent on Latin American census questions. That's the next book. Anyway, at the same time, people of African descent make up more than 40% of the poor in Latin America and have been consistently denigrated, marginalized as undesirable elements of the society since the abolition of slavery across Las Americas. Yet, constitutional equality law in Latin America contributes to the view that racism does not exist, despite being pervasive in Latin America and despite the advent of social justice movements and social science researchers demonstrating the contrary. When the BBC surveyed Latin Americans regarding the existence of racism, a significant number emphatically denied it, and many made statements such as, I'm quoting, Latin Americans are not racist, it's not a racist region, for the simple fact that the majority of the population is mixed. So the denial of racism is rooted in what many scholars have critiqued, including your very own Professor Mitchell, have critiqued as the myth of racial democracy. The notion that the racial mixture, the mestizaging in a population is emblematic of racial harmony and insulated from racial discord and inequality. Academic scholarship in at least the last 30 years has critiqued Latin American mestizaje theories of racial mixture as emblematic of racial harmony. Yet Latin Americans still very much adhere to the notion that racial mixture, and in particular the absence of Jim Crow racial segregation, are such a marked contrast to the United States racial history that the region views itself as what I call racially innocent. And too many judges in Latin America have long relied on these ideas when they automatically dismiss a discrimination lawsuit. In part, the absence of a legal critique of the Latin American comparisons to the Jim Crow U.S. has enabled the Latin American racial innocence stance to remain. In an earlier book, I provide the legal critique. Want to know more about that? Go get that book from the library. Specifically, the book is about the ways in which the Latin American denial of racism operating along with the notion that the true racism can only be found En el norte, in the racial segregation of the U.S., veils the actual manifestations of racism in Latin America. The book argues that an examination of the role of the state, government actors, right, after the abolition of slavery, in regulating race through immigration law and a whole host of customary law, when you look at that, it disrupts the picture of Latin America as racially innocent. The book assesses the ways in which the contemporary Latin American anti-discrimination laws venue seeks to eradicate the legacy of racial inequality wrought by the historic racism of the state. Today, the force of racism is so strong, and the denial of it, that the very term negro, black, is widely considered derogatory because people of African descent are stereotyped and referred to as inherently criminal, intellectually inferior, overtly sexual, and animalistic. Because the racialized stereotypes of Black people are pervasive. They're commonly understood in connection with animals to smell like animals, and in particular monkeys, hence this stamp that was in circulation for a bit before the outrage in Mexico. And I don't mean from 1940s. I mean in our contemporary society, right? In addition to these commonalities in anti-Black stereotypes across Latin America, each country in the region has also developed a subset of derogatory phrases for Black and Blackness. A review of newspapers in the region meticulously traced how racialized stereotypes for Blacks and anti-Black sentiment is ubiquitous across media outlets in the region. When I share this information about anti-Blackness in Latin America, in case this is like some noise that's in your head too, and so you can't listen because you got this other little response in your mind, let me kind of dispel it for you right now. When I share this information, a frequent response I get is, but Blackness is also a term of affection. Yes, and the use of racialized language as terms of endearment unconsciously and sometimes consciously invoke the paternalism of slavery's past. So, for instance, affections expressed by stating things like, that's my Black person, mi negrito, mi negrita, right? Or calling someone a little Black person. Even compliments directed towards those who are Black are reserved for those who are presumed to supersede their Blackness by having other superior traits. So you'll hear compliments. The people who love you can also be anti-Black. It doesn't cancel out the love. It just makes it complicated. So compliments can include, he's Black, but has the soul or the heart of a white person. She's Black, but good looking. He's Black, but well groomed and scented. So while these statements are not meant to carry the malice, right, of racism, they still activate racial stereotypes about the inferiority of Blackness. In fact, these perspectives about persons of African descent are so embedded in the social fiber of Latin American societies that their subordinated status is viewed as natural, logical, and racial exclusion is explained away as only about poverty, ay bendito, la pobreza, right? Or poor education. When we fix poverty, when we fix all the lack of proper education, then racism will be solved. Right? Moreover, when flagrant instances of racist conduct are detailed in the Latin American news media, they're understood as the acts of aberrant individuals who do not represent the greater racial tolerance that is associated or presumed to be associated with being part of Latin American culture. Indeed, Latin American racial denial is deeply embedded within racially hierarchical environments. This dualism has been historically facilitated by deployment strategic comparisons to the U.S. racial regime that are meant to depict Latin America as innocent of perpetrating racism. And that's why I call this rhetoric racial innocence. And I take that idea from the earlier book and bring it to the United States. All of which is to say that the legacy of slavery with its anti-Black justifications that upheld it, right, is just as relevant into the Latin American context as it is to the U.S. context. So when people from Latin America and the Caribbean migrate to the United States, or the U.S. lands on them, see Mexico, right, they bring along their racialized baggage with them and transmit it across generations into U.S. culture. If you believe that Latino culture is about the food, about the music, about the dance, etc., then you cannot divorce from that importance of that culture from the racial attitudes that are also culture as well. As disturbing as the anti-Black aspects of Latin American and Caribbean national cultures, for many Afro-Latinos in the United States, shift geography, right, the deepest racial scars are those inflicted within intimate familial structures. When it comes to Latino racism, the family is the scene of the crime. Racial trauma is instilled when Latino parents show preferential treatment to children with lighter skin and consistently make negative appraisals of Black racialized features, skin color, and hair texture. The book, in many ways, begins with those memoirs. It's storytelling, and you get those stories straight from the source. Upon adolescence, the familial vigilance against Blackness is intensified in the Latino project of pursuing and or maintaining a semblance of whiteness. Right? The obsession with mejorando y adelantando la raza, improving and advancing the race by marrying lighter and ideally whiter partners, means that each potential suitor is sorted for taints of Blackness. Stories about that in the book too. Yet anti-Black racism that arises outside of the unfortunately familiar U.S. frame of Anglo-white versus African-American bias can be mystifying for many people in the U.S. And this is in part because U.S. Blackness is primarily conceived of as embodied solely by English-speaking African-Americans. Can't you see all the confusion about the Haitians in the U.S. right now, right? They speak French. Are they Black? In turn, anti-Blackness is properly understood as a uniquely U.S. phenomena affecting those English-speaking African-Americans, with occasional recognition of the racialized struggles of Africans and other people in the African diaspora. Civil rights leaders are also seemingly reticent to air the dirty laundry of the bias that exists within communities of color, lest it distract from the real racism of white supremacy. However, all the while, Afro-Latinos and other people of African descent suffer from the acts of discrimination at the hands of Latinos who claim that their racially mixed cultures immunize them from being racist. This is what I call the Latino racial innocence cloak that veils Latino complicity in U.S. racism. In turn, the public ignorance about that Latino anti-Blackness undermines the ability to fully address it, to address the interwoven complexities of U.S. racism in developing public policies and in enforcing anti-discrimination law. The short story here is that judges and the rest of society need to learn that Latinos can be racist too. In the book that you can get copies of today, and that is also available in Espanol. So there's Spanish copy, not here, but if you want it, you can get it. I excavate the otherwise silenced voices of the Afro-Latino and African-American and other victims of Latino anti-Blackness from the case files of discrimination lawsuits. In examining how discrimination claims of Latino anti-Blackness arise, two central patterns become evident. First, Latino anti-Blackness is more prevalent and serious in its consequences than many commentators in politics and the media care to admit. Except, watch out for MSNBC, Paula Ramos. She's doing a good job by trying to lift this up. Right? Second, the ability to identify and address Latino anti-Blackness is hampered by the notion that Latinos cannot be prejudiced or racist simply because they're Latino. It is for this reason that the tales of Latino anti-Black discrimination recounted in court cases are so important, inasmuch as they help disrupt the Latino myth of racial innocence and clarify Latino agency in racism. The interrogation, the questioning of the pseudo defense of Latinos can't be prejudiced, this pseudo defense of racism, is especially illuminating for the legal enforcement of anti-discrimination law. So let me give you some examples. When Eddie Frazier, an African-American man, wanted to rent an apartment in the suburban Long Island community of Smithtown, New York, you may have some relatives there. It was a Latino homeowner who refused to consider his application. The Latino landlord instead chose to wait 3 more months for a non-Black applicant to surface. If any of you are landlord or you got family who are landlords, you may well immediately recognize that waiting 3 months without a rent roll, that's a sacrifice, right? That's a financial sacrifice. Yet a jury was persuaded that no racial discrimination had occurred due to the fact that the owner was a Latina who denied harboring racial bias because she was of mixed race heritage. And numerous of her relatives had Black, Indian ancestry. So this is to say, juries are not alone in being misled about Latino agency in racism. Let's talk about some judges. The case of Maxine Sprott is also illustrative. The book goes across the country, but I picked out some New York cases for you. Maxine Sprott, an African-American woman who worked as a deputy director of the New York City Housing Authority's Office of Equal Opportunity, NYCHA, alleged that her Latina supervisor, Office Director Rosalind Reyes, harassed her with derogatory comments about her work performance, despite the fact that Maxine was repeatedly getting positive performance evaluations. So, for instance, Director Reyes insinuated that even though Maxine had been studying equal opportunity courses at Cornell University, that she still didn't understand what it was all about. Each positive performance evaluation was then followed by commentary from Reyes about Maxine's lack of leadership in her role as a deputy director. She often excluded Maxine from office functions and meetings. So when Maxine could no longer withstand this onslaught of derogatory commentary about her competence, she files a discrimination claim with the general manager of NYCHA. Exactly 3 days after Maxine filed her discrimination claim, Director Reyes, for the first time, submitted a performance evaluation that rated her as marginal. And as a result, Maxine was denied a managerial merit salary increase. We call that retaliation. But anyway, any expectations that Maxine might have had that working for an equal opportunity division within NYCHA, right, focused on addressing discrimination in public housing, that it would be a more racially enlightened, evolved workplace, were shredded when her employer not only failed to investigate her allegations, but then retaliated against her for filing a claim. In fact, it was yet another Latino NYCHA official, Chairman Ruben Franco, that discriminatorily retaliated against Maxine. To be very specific, when Maxine refused to be quiet, Chairman Franco informed her that she was going to be transferred and was transferred to another office where her material responsibilities were diminished, and she was moved out of her well-furnished private office into the cubicle. We all know they may not call that a demotion, but if you ever had an ability to have your lunch quietly in a private office, make some personal phone calls during your lunch break, and then move to a cubicle, that's a whole other work experience. Everybody knows your business. Everybody's watching you. I don't know. So only when Maxine files a lawsuit in court is she then able to move NYCHA to consider a settlement agreement and receive financial compensation. Now, any number of concerns might have influenced Maxine and her attorney to settle the case rather than move forward with a jury trial. But one contributing factor that could very well have been of great significance was the emphasis the judge placed upon racial diversity as mitigating, as cutting against her claim of discrimination. For the judge, it was immaterial that when Chairman Franco transferred Maxine to her little cubicle as effectively, a lesser position, it was being done at the same time as two other African-American female employees were being terminated, all part of Franco's ostensible reorganization plan. Like he was reorganizing all the black people out the office, right? Instead, the judge concluded that such facts failed to raise an inference of discrimination. I'm quoting from the judge. Why? Because the new director is a Hispanic woman. The remaining staff is comprised of 24 Hispanics. And one other person categorized as other. Thus, the judge equates a Latino-dominated workplace and the supervisor's Hispanic status with great power to circumvent racism. Here and there is the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be bearers of racism. A corollary of the judicial presumption that Latino co-workers cannot be the bearers of racism is the judicial notion that all Latino places of origin are racial equivalents. Venezuela is Argentina, is Chile, etc. Right? The case of Arrocha versus CUNY provides a useful illustration. I don't want to get too close to home, but I thought this might be useful. Right, okay. Medgar Evers. That's what, just to be, it's in a public record, so I'm not telling tales out of, Okay. Jose Arrocha, a self-identified Afro-Panamanian tutor of Spanish, sues his university employer for failure to renew his appointment as an adjunct instructor. He alleged that the Latinos who directed the department where he worked discriminated against, and these are his words, Black Hispanics, and that there was a disturbing culture of favoritism that favored the appointments of, and he goes through a list. He says, white Cubans, Spaniards, white Hispanics from South America. Yet the court quickly dismisses his claims because it wasn't an understanding of the ways in which a color hierarchy informs the way in which Latinos not only experience racism, but also national origin bias from other Latinos. We are not a homogeneous pan-ethnic grouping. So, the dismissal of the case was justified based on the fact that 5 of the 8 instructors that were reappointed instead of Jose were natives of other South and Central American countries like Argentina, Peru, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. The judge explicitly stated in the opinion, here I'm quoting, diversity in an employer's staff undercuts an inference of discriminatory intent, which is not the actual law. That's not law from cases, it's not law from a statute, it's not from the Constitution. Instead, the judge sort of does a jazz freestyle, interprets from his gut, his intuition, where he infers non-discrimination from the presumption that Latino ethnic subgroups are all interchangeable and homogeneous. So this Afro-Panamanian didn't get placed. But, somebody from Mexico did, so it's all the same. This perspective fails to appreciate the ways in which internal Latino national origin bias is tied to a racialized hierarchy of Latin American countries, where countries perceived or touted as more European are viewed as more advanced and cultured, when they are more significantly populated by people who are white rather than indigenous or primarily Afro-descendant. So in the list, let's go back to that list. So the judge said, it's all the same, so no discrimination. The list the judge found were all equivalent, indicating absence of racism. Latin American racial constructs would rank Argentina number 1, highly valued white country. Though if you've been watching the NPR Little Desk concert, not so white. But anyway, but the presumption is, right? The image is that it's white. You haven't seen Catriel's little NPR Little Desk concert? I highly recommend you get onto YouTube. Got the songs in my mind right now. Okay. La que puede, puede. Next, after Argentina, would be Peru and Mexico, with the stereotype that it's a primarily indigenous population. There are black people in all these places, but these are like the stereotypes, the labeling that we have in Latin American discourse. Right? And most derided would be the Dominican Republic and the claimant's own country of origin of Panama because of their presumed dominance by Afro-descendants. So for Latinos influenced by Latin American racial paradigms, where each country has a racial identification, a diverse workforce of Latinos is not the immediate equivalent of a bias-free context, nor is a color preference divorced from a racialized ideology within the Latino context. Now, let me pause here for a second, because it's also important to note that Latino anti-Blackness also shows up not only as an expression of individual Latino racial attitudes, but also in systemic structures of intentional exclusion. Let's give poor New York a little break. Let's head over to Chicago. Right? So in the case of Hunt versus Personnel Staffing, right, Latino employees of a Chicago-based nationwide job placement agency described how their Latino supervisors trained them to exclude African American applicants from job placements in favor of Latino applicants. They were taught to automatically reject African American applicants because of the stereotype they were not as capable of working as hard as Latinos. This is what they would be told in their training. The lawsuit details how dispatchers, who nevertheless sent African American job seekers to a company because they dissented, they didn't believe in that. These employees would later be reprimanded by their Latino bosses for doing so and threatened with being terminated. The placement agency would start the day by separating out Hispanic job applicants from African Americans. The little internalized Jim Crow right there, right, in Chicago. They would enter the Hispanic applicants' contact information to a database so they could be easily reached when jobs opened up. African Americans rarely received the same treatment. Instead, Black applicants were instructed to go to an office at dawn to wait for assignments that never seemed to materialize. One agency dispatcher testified, and she's one of the dissenters, she didn't believe in this. If it was 10 Mexicans that would come at 1:30 p.m. and 25 African Americans that were there since 4:30 in the morning and were waiting to be sent to work, the agency would send the Mexicans first. This Latino-run employment agency effectively ensured a secondary racial caste system of Latinos over Blacks in the already segregated Chicago area labor market that privileges Anglo-whiteness. This case was successfully defended for those claimants. Now, before I close out, I want to address a concern I often hear that maybe this is also percolating in your minds, right? And it's that people of color cannot be racist because they do not have power. When Latinos and other people of color, for that matter, are active participants in the denial of access to an important life opportunity, a job, a home, an unimpeded education, fairness in the criminal justice system, entrance into public spaces. Those are topics that I also address in the book. Based on race, those Latinos are no longer just passive holders of anti-Black cultural prejudice. They are part of the problem of racism. Certainly, none of the victims of anti-Black bias in the narrative of discrimination that I examined in my research would be placated with the disclaimer, oh, your experience is not an example of racism because Latinos don't have the systemic power to be racist in white Anglo-created structures. One, they say, what are you talking about? But two, right, one can immediately envision such a victim replying, oh yeah, that so-called non-racist Latino is the one who oppressed me for being Black. Talk to me when their boot is not on my neck. A Latino claim of racial innocence in the racist world white Anglos created in the U.S. is a very thin moral read of superiority when a Latino hand is the one forcefully slamming the door to Black inclusion. So the book is more than just a call for recognizing that Latinos can be prejudiced too, so that's an important contribution. Rather, it's an entreaty for all future interventions into matters of racism to critically engage how Latinos and many others collaborate and sustain structures of racism. By recognizing that they're part of the problem, interventions can also address them as part of the solution. Judges and juries can be taught to desist from the being distracted, right, by the "I can't be racist, I'm Latino" pseudo defense to accusations of discrimination. In short, dismantling racism in the U.S. requires that every component of its structures be taken apart, even the ones articulated en español, in Spanish. We do this by becoming racially literate about Latino anti-Blackness and engaging in meaningful coalition work. I'll give you some examples. And on a pleasant note, before we get into the question and answer session, this is a national organization. This is a Los Angeles-based one. And here's one out of Boston. Okay? So we're going to get to the question and answer session. Okay? But I did want to thank you all once again while I formally have the floor, and also to remind you, in case you're looking for Christmas presents for your loved ones, that the book is in Spanish. And one of the reasons why it was very important to me to have the book in Spanish is because I wanted for Latino families to be able to talk about the issues and share their own insights, like a little mini book club, across language preferences. Okay, so how are we organizing this? How are we proceeding? Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Hernandez. So we'll begin the Q&A. We have a very short time, about 8 to 10 minutes. If we could keep a look at our questions and comments.
I should say that if you don't get in on the 8 minutes, you can find me very easily. I'm at the Fordham University Law School website, so you can find me, my email's there and everything else, so chatting.
Professor, thank you once more for the lecture. I just wanted to quickly ask, a point that you touched on is you wanted Latino families to have the ability to sort of transcend the myth that people of color cannot be prejudiced. In terms of addressing that with children and with future generations that might not even sort of consciously realize it as a moral failure, because we're all sort of socialized by our families, it might not even be a conscious choice to act in a certain way or perceive the world in a certain way. How do you see such an issue being addressed when a lot of families in themselves who influence how their children are going to grow up and interact with other people don't really see it as a moral or ethical issue?
Well, I have to say that this very dynamic was one that the work of social psychologists I found very informative. Right? Because what they better help me understand is that attitudes, biases, etc., they are not taught, they're caught. I love that phrase. It was easy for me to remember, right? But what these social psychologists mean by that is, it's not, people say, well, my family never taught me these things in my house. We were a bias-free household. And that's beautiful. I love it for you, right? However, it's not just about what your parents and your other family members said to you about what was the right way to act in the world. It was how they conducted themselves. So many of the stories in the book about the family trauma are about the experiencing of lighter skinned Latino family members pulling back, when having to touch darker skinned family members. A young child, a 3 and a 4-year-old, doesn't have to be told things. They watch. They are constantly watching us. So if we want to imbue a better world for them, right, our actions have to imbue that better world. It's not just our actual intentional language. And, there's no simple, easy way around this. And that's why often when young people say to me, oh, well, how can I talk to my parents about this? I said, the very first thing is, put your hand down. No finger waving, no right? Maybe because I'm on the other side of the particular age dynamic. Nobody appreciates finger wagging at them telling what is wrong or right. But share what you are learning about. When you share what you are reading about, hearing about, it's like having a conversation about some movie you just watched that you found super interesting. That opens a conversation rather than having people shut down. Oftentimes, I think part of the blinders that we have within Latino families in particular is because we have this notion of a taboo. We don't bring up the topic of race because that's racist. But if we have a space in which to actually name what we've been seeing, observing, it's much more productive.
Hello. So I essentially just wanted to make a comment about how I have personally experienced like anti-blackness as a black Afro-Latino, because I'm Haitian and that's not even considered a Latina country because of the black majority. It's very complicated because it's like we decided to rebel. It's like there's a lot of like anti-Haitian ismo towards us, particularly from the Dominican Republic. But yeah, I'm just glad that we can talk about that because it's just like, I think honestly as an Afro Latino, because I'm Haitian, it's like I feel like I can't even, like when I see like sisters say, oh, this is a Latino space, I'm questioning in my head like, is it really Latino? Like if I were to go in and say like, hey, like I'm Haitian, I'm Latino, would they look at me weird, or would they be like, oh no, like or would they like, I don't know. I feel like just I constantly have to think whether they're woke or not, and it's frustrating, but it's also like I wouldn't trade being Haitian for anything because I am proud of my culture and the fact that, we freed ourselves.
Hi. So my question has to do more so with like the upcoming election. How do you think the anti-Black bias in Latino communities affects their voting habits?
Well, that's why I earlier mentioned the work of the journalist Paula Ramos. She has a brand new book all about her research into white supremacists in the Latino community and her assessments of what it means for this upcoming election. The one thing that I will say about this is that, well, I have many political scientists in the room, so you are already familiar, right? But this idea of linked fate. So in studies within Latino communities, the idea is that people vote more cohesively with their group when they have a sense of linked fate, meaning that you think how I vote is important not just to me as an individual, but it's important to a particular identity group that I feel affiliated with. Right? But what has been studied is that Latinos don't necessarily have linked fate when they experience discrimination from one another. So I don't feel so excited, right, about, let me vote like a Latina, right, if I feel that within Latinidad, I've experienced harm. So part of this notion of being a united front really has to do with the intersectionalities. If there are hierarchies within a group, it's very hard to galvanize that group to feel like, oh yeah, all of us all together, we're a cohesive unit and we need to march in simultaneously. got me sweating.
Could you speak to how, like, the exoneration of people of color from racism has contributed to, like, growing anti-Arab sentiment in the U.S.?
You know, I never thought about it that way before, but that is a very, I think, productive way to kind of parse out some of what we are seeing, right? This notion that if we don't take accountability for the ways in which racism is not simply a us versus them, meaning only white Anglo-speaking individuals, and it's an internal dynamic as well, well, then it would also feature into these other aspects of anti-Arab sentiment that we're seeing today. That I've never kind of did the work on that, but it makes sense to me as you say it.
Okay, thank you. I wonder, I mean, what made you choose to research this subject matter? Another thing is, I was wondering, do you think if maybe I'm an African immigrant, suppose I was the one that was doing this research, would it be kind of received in the same way? And then suppose it was an African American who was doing the research. Do you think that the receptivity to the legitimacy even of the subject would be as the same across the board?
I'm going to start from your latter question and work my way back. I think that all those individuals that you just named would get a different intensity of the very same kind of response. So meaning oh, you don't understand because you have a U.S. mindset about this. You may be Latina, but you think too much like the U.S. Right? So because I do cross-border work, 2 weeks I'll be in Cali, Colombia. I am very familiar, right, with the ways in which what the reactions look like. The level of that kind of rejection, you don't know, because it would only increase the more you are out that circumference, right? But I don't think something different, or as I've heard people say in Africa, right? Same, different, right? So there's that. Then your first part of your question is like, what brought me to this work? I grew up in New York City, right? My family's from the Caribbean, but I grew up here in New York City within a Latino community, and I was constantly always hearing, right, this sort of schizophrenia, meaning, oh, we are so much better than los Americanos because we're not racist, we are good people, at the very same time, same paragraph, same sentence, right? Well, they come out with the most foul anti-Black kinds of phrases and utterances, right? So there was that background. As a law person, right, as a law-trained individual who does research on civil rights, when I started to see this little trend, little but disturbing, right, of this kind of same dynamic showing up in cases, and judges and juries think, oh, well, that's not so important, or yes, that's correct because a Latino, this is different. Civil rights law doesn't apply. The Constitution's equality principle doesn't apply. That's what galvanized me to put pen to paper, finger to keyboard.
Thank you so much. We can have just 2 more minutes. I have a few announcements. First, thanks to the generosity of Professor Hernandez, we do have complimentary copies of the book Racial Innocence for the students in the room, so afterwards please come on up. Second, tomorrow afternoon at 2:15, right here in the Tanger, we are going to celebrate the 50 years of the Women and Gender Studies program, so please be here. And on November 18th, last year's Konefsky lecture, NYU law professor Melissa Murray will be engaged in a conversation on the election with Barbara Smith and Paul Ortiz, 2 former Hess scholars themselves. That will be online. Please join us. Thank you so much to the Konefsky family. Thank you